Welcome back to California Live Podcast. And today I'm extremely excited to introduce to you a new friend of mine. Hopefully I could call you, sir, a friend. I know we've just met, but I think that the meeting that we had was really friendly. Mr. Rich Culver, thank you so much for coming to the show today.
Thank you, Victor. And I'm honored that you'd call me a friend. I too enjoyed our conversation. You meet a lot of people a lot of the time, and it sometimes can be hard to get beyond sort of a superficial discussion. But I feel like you and I connected, and I enjoyed your company. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Mr. Rich, I know that you're coming from Australia, and I've learned that you've traveled quite a bit during your childhood. And I would assume that that was one of the things that helped build your career, your vision, your passion. Could you please share with us, with our viewers, about your childhood, all those travels, your family, and what helped you build towards who you are today?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think, and you only sort of understand these things as you get older, but I really do now understand what a privileged childhood I had. I was born in South Africa, and my mum and my her new husband, the man that became my father, he was my stepfather, but he was my father through my life. We left, I guess, when I was about 5 years old, nearly 6. And we ended up following Dad and his career around the world. He was an engineer, and a wonderful one at that. And we had the privilege of living in many different countries as Dad pursued his professional passions and did it so well. So we moved to the UK. We lived in Scotland for a few months. We ended up moving to what is currently the Ukraine and living near in a town called Gorlovka near Donetsk. In eastern Ukraine. It was the Soviet Union when we were there back in the 70s. I'm showing my age now. Before going back to the UK, spending some more time in living in London, and then moving out to Iraq, where we lived in the Western Desert near the border with Syria, actually, in a purpose-built camp in support of a chemical refinery that Dad was project managing the build of. So we lived there in the late 70s, and we left the country. We left Iraq right around the time that Saddam Hussein took power, actually, unfortunately. And we ended up moving to Australia in the first of a couple of stints in Australia. Moved around within Australia as we always did. We moved, it felt like sort of every 1 to 2 years. So we stayed in Australia for a couple of years, moving around, and then we moved to Singapore. Where I had a wonderful experience doing all my high school in Singapore as a teenager there. Went to the international school, and that was probably the longest place that I lived, actually, as a kid, because we were there for nearly 4 years before we went back to Australia, and from there I joined the army. So the military, the military sort of put me on my professional career, but my childhood, I think, set me up for success in everything that's happened since I joined the military and beyond, because I think I was fortunate to be somebody that kind of thrived in the fact that we were moving around, and it didn't really bother me. And I always sort of adapted to the new places that we would be living, whether it was a camp in the desert or, a beach suburb in Sydney. I adapted fairly easily and fairly well. Living in the Ukraine as a youngster, and having that incredible experience in Iraq and then in Singapore as well, I think it just taught me to be really versatile, really adaptable, and it taught me to be very culturally sensitive. I'm easier. It's not an issue for me to be around foreign cultures. I've been around them since I could learn to walk. Since I learned to walk and talk. And I enjoy them. So I think that has really sort of parlayed itself well into the corporate environment in terms of, joining a new company, getting to know people, establishing effective working relationships, and so on. I pin all of that to my childhood. And like I said, I think that's only a realization I've had since I've been older.
Right. Well, that's a fascinating story. Which of the countries do you think helped you build your character more? Scotland, England, Iraq, Singapore?
Look, they all contributed, but I think, look, you know yourself as a teenager, that's where you start to sort of spread your wings and establish your really your own identity. I went to a really great, very small but really great high school there that had a great curriculum. So I had some choice in my classes as I got older, almost like a college type situation. You know, friends from just myriad different cultures around the world at the international school. So I think Singapore and the other great thing about Singapore was, you know, such a safe environment, really. So as a teenager who wants to be independent, you could be independent in Singapore and really do so quite safely. My parents didn't have to worry about me too much at night. You know, I think as opposed to sort of, I have teenage kids now and I worry about them nonstop. So I think Singapore was the one that had the most profound effect on me. But they were all remarkable, really. You know, at the time, of course, as a child, you're just like, oh well, I live in the Ukraine now. But it's an extraordinary experience when you look back at it.
Right. Mr. Rich, if we could recall, if you could recall some of the most memorable moments of your childhood, what would those be? And from the perspective of an adult right now, how do you think they impacted your personal development?
That's a great question. I think I talked about culture and being exposed to different cultures, and you know, I was homeschooled in the Ukraine for a while. That was impactful for me, and my mother and I still talk about that, both in good and bad ways, when we lived in what is the former Soviet Union. You know, going to a French school in Iraq, because that was all that was available in the camp that we were at, and learning to speak both of those languages quite well at a young age. I don't speak really much now, as you don't use it. Those things were profound. I also I had a very kind and patient family environment and a very supportive one. So I was lucky in that although there was so much disruption when we moved all the time, it wasn't chaotic. It wasn't unnecessarily uncomfortable. You know, people, everybody in my family, you know, was very calm and measured all the time. And there was always a really sort of strong focus on education and development. So I'm lucky to not have to point to anything unduly traumatic for me as a child, and really point more to the kindness and the empathy and the intellect that I was around with my mum and my dad, as real shapers, and you know, as people that I wished I was more like as I got older.
Right. Well, that's very interesting, because people talk a lot about challenging situations or hardships, and your perspective brings up another side. It's like kindness and empathy builds your character even stronger. So now you are such a great kind gentleman that you know, could be a great example for millions, if not billions, of people.
Maybe. I mean, you know, when we left South Africa, when I was very, very young, before my mum met my dad, you know, we were in the middle of getting out of you know, my mum was really got me and got her both out of, you know, the relationship that she was in with my natural father, and that was not a good situation. So my very earliest memories are probably, you know, in the ages of like 3 to 4. Probably associated more with fear, right? Because that was the atmosphere that I remember, as there was this very difficult situation going on between my biological dad and my mum. But then that all changed, and you know, I had this wonderful man that became my dad in our lives, and just, you know, the integrity and compassion and kindness and strictness, very firm, that I was raised, I think put me on the right track. I was lucky.
Right. You mentioned you went to good schools, including a high school in Singapore. How about your hobbies or extracurricular activities? Have you done anything? What were your interests back then?
Oh, look, at school, you know, my friends and I would get around Singapore on our bicycles. I mean, I had an incredible level of fitness as a kid. I participated in all the team sports. Basketball, if you see how tall I am, you'll understand why that stopped. and then also played rugby and soccer. Played cricket for my dad's team. My dad's office had a cricket team. I learned to play badminton in Singapore and loved. So I just a lot of different interests. So I probably was I was a master of none of them. I was just sort of solid at many of them, right? Which has set me up relatively well for success in terms of being able to fit in and do whatever the sport du jour is, wherever I am, whether it's the military or anything like that. And some of those activities continued through to the military, and then recently, when I was living here in California, I got into triathlons and things like that, and tapped into those old riding muscles and things like that. So fitness and health, notwithstanding the challenges of time and space as you get older and the demands of your job and families and things like that, have always been an interest of mine. Reading, and I've read a lot in my life, and I don't read as much as I would like to now. But that was something else that particularly when you're changing countries and you're the only kid in the neighborhood that speaks English, you learn to entertain yourself in different ways, right?
Right. Yeah. From all of these stories, I can see that line of discipline and self-discipline, because when you read, you need discipline to finish the book, right? When you play different sports, it's discipline. It's not so much of a motivation, but it's discipline. And
it's true. And again, that's where my, obviously the military sort of supercharged that when I got to that phase of my life. But my parents were always, there was just a lot of structure, and despite changing countries and continents, on a regular basis, there was that drive to succeed, to learn, to be in an effective routine, and just generally better yourself. When we took family holidays, we didn't go and lie on the beach. My dad was. There's not an art gallery or a cathedral in Europe that I haven't been into and spent many hours in, because that's what we would do. So holidays for us were generally going and excavating the history of some particular part of Ireland or France, and the cathedrals that were there, and the art galleries and the museums. That's what we would do, right? I never had a holiday on the beach when I was a kid.
That's fantastic. I can relate to that. My parents were also extremely active when we were kids, and we would travel around Europe. And as you said, all the cathedrals or the museums, we were there. You mentioned that you went to the army. What made you decide to join the army, and which forces did you serve? How did it go for you?
It was a wonderful experience. And I had always been interested. A lot of my reading when I was a kid was military, fiction, and then it became nonfiction, I guess, as I got older. And then so I'd sort of had aspirations to join the military probably since I was 7 or 8 years old. I didn't really think that I would do anything else. There wasn't much else that interested me. And then I took a class in high school in Singapore, and I had an American, a US teacher for this class, and we just did a lot of study on the Vietnam War and literature associated with the Vietnam War and so on, that was just profoundly shaping for me as well, and really sort of locked in the fact that that was what I wanted to do. Right. So when we got back to Australia, I'd finished high school when I was 17, got back to Australia, started the application process and joined the military when I was 18. A couple of months after my 18th birthday was when I took off. And I went into the infantry as a private soldier, and then I got selected to get commissioned. And so I went to the Officer Training Academy off the back of that. I don't know why I did this, but I went back to the infantry after I became an officer. And then served in various infantry units around Australia, and then training appointments, training either soldiers or training officer cadets as well. I went back and did some training there before I left in 2001. at the time, I considered myself unfortunate, but I think in hindsight and knowing what I know now, I think I'm fortunate that I didn't get to experience any operational service. Australia was very much, the Australian Army was very much a peacetime army when I was in, and that all sort of, that was starting to change with East Timor, and then obviously 9/11 happened and everything that followed on from there. So all the guys and girls that I served with who stayed in went on to have extraordinary careers with more, sort of combat experience than I think any of them could have imagined. Whereas I basically, was in the what I consider to be the sweet spot of a peacetime army, and I feel like I got all the benefits of the training and the experience and leading troops and all of those sorts of things, without the jeopardy and the downstream risks that come with conflict. So it was an amazing experience, an amazing career, but I'm glad I left when I did. I'd gotten to a point that I was a little bit jaded that we weren't doing more overseas, had I known. And I also wanted to, I had moved around my whole life, and all of a sudden I've been in Australia for 12 years, and I'm like, I wanted to move, right? So that's why I upped and left and moved to the UK to restart my career.
Right. Before we continue, if I may ask, and please feel free to say no, I have a question about the current situation in the world, but not from a political perspective. You are a military professional. Since the time when Soviet Union collapsed, we got some sort of transition from a bipolar world to a one-polar world, and now it's been changing recently towards, again, two-polar. How do you see the reasons of the development in the world, all these wars around the globe? And as a professional, if you could share with us a few thoughts of yours of potential perspectives of development.
Well, and let me make it, and that's a great question, and probably the subject of about another 20 podcasts, but I'll give you my personal thoughts, and these in no way indicate, the opinions of any of the companies I work for, that I have worked for or do work for, anything like that. I think if you look to history, you see that this is the cycle in terms of how the world continues to evolve, right? You have the rise and fall of empires that happens cyclically and naturally, and now, and if you look at the causal factors for all of those sorts of things, and the causal factors for conflict, they tend to be around the constants and of religion, natural resources, those sorts of issues. And I think we're seeing the same thing now in a world that has a huge population and a population that's placing a lot of challenges on natural resources, the ability to provide food and water for the world's population, compounded by climate change, and shrinking the shrinking availability of resources, natural resources in particular. I think is causing a disruption to the world order that we're all sort of familiar with from, let's say, the post-World War II era. I think that's probably the most succinct answer that I can give to that question, without diving deeper on some of the other issues and how we find ourselves here and passing comment on particular regimes, which I don't really want to. So I do feel like the agendas at stake broadly are natural resources and the control of either those resources themselves or access to. And I think that those, and then obviously layer in some of the religious and racial issues around the world, and I think you start to see some of the problems that are causing, the terrible types of conflict that are occurring around the world at the moment.
Right. If you could share with us any, again, in your personal opinion, possible potential outcomes on the world arena in the next 5 years.
Oh, I don't want to speculate about that. I think, look, I think for me as a as a security professional, there's a level of unpredictability in
Right.
world events right now that is slightly uncomfortable and not a circumstance that I'm used to from my professional career, certainly since the military. The unpredictability before was fairly tactical and localized around acts and incidents, whereas I think the unpredictability now is much more geopolitical and strategic and has sort of longer reaching implications. So I think it's an unprecedented time in human history, particularly because of the potential consequences at stake for everybody, for humanity. My instinct is that things will get probably a little bit worse before they get better, because that tends to be what, if we look to history, that's what happens. But I can only hope that sanity will prevail and that we will that human beings will do what's right for humanity. The other part of all of this is, and this is a very personal concern for me and those that I know and love, and that is just the effects of climate change and the pressure that's also. So you've got the dual problems, right, of climate change and the unpredictability associated with that, and then you've got these geopolitical issues that are causing a lot of problems as well. So it's a very sensitive time for humanity, is probably the best way I can put it.
That's fantastic. It's probably the best answer I could have expected.
Thank you.
In this situation right now, which we have in the world, on one hand, it's unpredictable with the climate. On the other hand, we have geopolitical situation. What would be your advice to our viewers, to the community, how to better be prepared, how to better, protect themselves?
I think that's a great question. Look, I think knowledge is power, right? So information, and this is one of the other sort of concerns I have about the global ecosystem at the moment is there's never been more misinformation and disinformation around than there is now, right? And people, and I'm not pointing at any particular group of people. I just think people in general are accessing information more readily and more freely, but with less scrutiny on the sources than ever before, right? So you need information, it's there, but the ability to quality control, and even the instinct to quality control the source and understand the source and validate the source to make an informed assessment and get an informed opinion, I think has changed. So the first thing I would say is, look to a variety of different information sources to stay apprised of what's going on, and to stay informed in a way that's reliable and trustworthy, because I think that's one of the biggest gaps that's out there at the moment. I think it's always prudent to have contingency plans, both personal and for yourself as an individual, and also for a family. I mean, we live in California. There's the ever-present threat of earthquakes. So to me, it should be second nature that everybody's got, earthquake kits in their cars, in their houses. People should have contingency plans as a family around how you're going to regroup and get together if something happens. Anything happens with, mum's at work, dad's working from home, kids are at school. How does the family reconnect and reunite in a disrupted logistics environment that's been impacted by an incident of some kind? Ideally, you have a plan. I think the other weakness that I see in a lot of planning in general is reliance on communications. And I think that whether it's an earthquake or something worse than that, one of the first things that's going to go down is the communications infrastructure. So your plans need to be built around not having ready access to technology, not having access to communications, and not having that for a period of days, right? We're not talking minutes and hours, we're talking days and potentially weeks. So I think looking at your key locations, work, school, workplaces, schools, homes, that sort of thing, having a plan around how you regroup, having a plan around how you get back together without communications, and then the ability to survive unsupported with whatever logistics you need, food, water, makeshift shelter, those sorts of things for a period of days at least, I think is, to me, is, you know, pretty much common sense and something I'd encourage everybody to do.
Let's dive back to your career. You mentioned that you stopped working with the army or at the army, serving the army around the early 2000s, and then you started your professional career. How did it start? How did you make decision which direction to take? Could you please share with us these details? Because a lot of young people right now, when they decide which college to go to or what to do in life, they have no clue how to navigate.
Yeah, and I, you know, personally, I think that that's one of the hardest things as a young person at any time. But I can imagine, you know, these days it's as hard as any other period in history. That step from sort of that jump to your professional career is a tough one to make. It's a tough one to figure out and a tough one to make. So I think the first thing I'd say to young people is, don't overthink it too much. You know, you can have more than one career, and most people do have 2 or 3 careers, right? So for me, it was the military, which I left, you know, just before 9/11 in mid 2001, and then I was able to, you know, parlay that into a career in the security space. I did some consulting for a law enforcement agency in Australia before I moved to the UK. And then worked with an old colleague from the Australian Army, delivering some consulting to the Commonwealth Games in Manchester in 2002. But, you know, while I was doing that, I did some other freelance work and a fair bit of networking with industry, what are now industry peers. And I was fortunate enough to land a consulting gig that turned into a full-time job at a company called International SOS in London. You know, I'd had the benefit of again, looking back, you don't realize it at the time. At the time, you're thinking, God, why are we doing this? But I had really a wonderful education at the Royal Military College of Australia. And I think, you know, of the many skills that came out of that training for us as graduates of that program, the ability, you know, crisis management generally, the ability, the mental agility to deal with crises where there's no playbook and figure out quickly understand what's going on, figure out a plan, and then execute. That was something that stood me well through my career, and I was able to very quickly parlay that into corporate, and make a success of working with the incredible International SOS team, supporting what became a really busy period. So, you know, you can imagine early 2000s, post 9/11. There was a lot of terrorist activity going on around the world, and we had a lot of corporate clients exposed. And so, you know, again, my military training and experience, you know, set me up well to sort of be able to deal with a fairly unpredictable and chaotic environment. So I was lucky in that regard.
Well, luck, it's what we say when the preparation meets the opportunity.
Yes, well said. Well said.
It's not just a given gift. You were ready, and then the opportunity showed up. While you were working at all these companies or for these companies, did you develop any businesses of your own?
I didn't. A regret of mine, but I did. You know, particularly with International SOS, which was a company that supported corporate clients wherever they were operating around the world. I did, you know, basically take a very much seedling consulting business there, and sort of, you know, we had a lot of success as a team building that business in the region over the close to 6 years that I ended up being there, and turned it into a multi-million-dollar just consulting business. Whereas, you know, in historically, ISOS hadn't had that much of a book of business in that space. So I quickly learned in that environment. I quickly learned the value of customer service and being relentlessly focused on that, right? And unwaveringly and uncompromisingly focused on that as a means to, you know, attract and retain clients and credibility and everything that came with it. And then hand in hand with that, the need to, even though I was part of a much bigger beast, grow the business organically and not too quickly, because quality of service needed to be maintained regardless, right? So you couldn't, I think you're, as a business, as I would imagine, if you're running your own business, because it was my experience in my career, even though I've not been running my own business, you're really only as good as your last World Cup, right? And as soon as you drop the ball, then your reputation takes a hit, and it can really blow back on you. So you've got to make sure you can deliver.
Exactly. Very well said, Mr. Rich. Right now, you have a very interesting position. You are senior vice president at one of the major studios. I don't know if we're allowed to say the name of the studio.
At Sony Pictures. That's correct.
Right. How did you build your career towards this position?
Well, I would love to tell you that it was intentional, but it wasn't, right? As I said, I had the job in London with ISOS, and they moved me and my family to Philadelphia to their America's headquarters. And in the course of my work out of the Americas office, I was fortunate enough to be introduced to an opportunity at Fox, where I took a role at the end of 2008, and I spent nearly about 11 years at Fox before getting the opportunity at Sony. So the fact that I'm here is really the culmination of that experience, track and set, I suppose. I think again, I took the principles of customer service and building slowly to my job and through my job at Fox, and that helped to take the department from a fairly, I would say, a fairly limited scope to a much broader scope, supporting the company more broadly and more proactively, and that led to success where we needed it, and we were able to add value, right? And it's adding value beyond your core business, by being analytical, by assessing changes in the environment, threats, being able to respond quickly and effectively, building capability without adding significant overhead and cost, being mindful always of those sorts of things. That's the sort of mindset I've always had through my career, certainly post-military, and that served me well. I think those attributes probably have served me the best through my career and enabled me to be successful.
Thank you so much. I have a little follow-up question. What do you believe was, or which characteristics of yours were those which help you to stand out, comparing to the other candidates which were applying for the same position at Sony and then and also at Fox?
Look, I think, it's interesting. My background, isn't the kind of usual background that you'll see in a role like this, because of my start with the Australian military and that kind of thing. I think, look, I approach my job with, and I don't know that this is necessarily a differentiator, but I'm fairly uncompromising on the requirements and the standards that I set, and I think I have a reputation that supports that. I think I'm good at, establishing effective working relationships with people quickly. Right. You have, when you're in my line of work, you need to have good working relationships with the other corporate functions, and you need to get those quickly. And I've got a track record of doing that in environments with very different and very differing management structures, right? I think I'm also, and I think people from the military sometimes struggle with this, but I'm also good with ambiguity. Ambiguity doesn't bother me. Right. In fact, to a certain extent, I almost prefer it, because then I can navigate my own pathway through it, right, and sort of understand it through my own lens. So I'm good. I don't need to be told what to do. I always have a strong instinct for the right things to do in most situations, and the right direction for departments to go. I think strategically, and those sort of attributes are the ones that I think have helped me be successful. Again, being strategic, building good relationships, delivering and follow through. Customer service, again, it comes back to that all the time, and having that customer service mentality, and then just making sure that you build capability without adding excessive or too much incremental cost.
Right. Mr. Rich, having this position, it's a lot of responsibility, and I would assume, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it also might mean a lot of stress at work, stress with the customers, any other types of stress. How do you deal with stress in your life? What is your recipe of dealing with it? And how do you balance this stress, your work, and then also having a wonderful family?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know that there's any silver bullet or panacea for that. I think listen, you've got to be able to keep things in perspective,
Right.
and you've got to not take things personally, right? You've got to build a structure. Again, I come back to the capability statement that doesn't rely solely on, like me as the department head. There needs to be redundancy. There needs to be flexibility in the architecture of the organization to be able to deal with different things at different times. I just think, as with any sort of senior executive role, whether it's mine or finance or any other, job, that's part of the stress or pressure, perhaps is a better word, is part of what comes with the territory. I'm lucky in some respects, is that, the more pressure there is, the more I tend to feel like I thrive a little bit. I thrive in a little bit of chaos, and I enjoy chaos, and trying to figure out a pathway through it. I think of the pandemic as an example of that. So, those sorts of, hard work and being under pressure, particularly in my role with the things that we need to deliver when the pressure is on, I enjoy that. And then, I used to sort of rely heavily on fitness and working out, and like triathlon was a big outlet for me. I don't do that anymore, but look, chess, reading, just getting on the couch and watching a movie with the kids, or getting in the pool, just being active, and just, compartmentalizing things and stepping away from the phone or the laptop for at least an hour, a couple of hours a night. And obviously, to the extent that you can on weekends, probably as anybody else does. Again, I don't think I have a magic bullet there. So it's just something that needs to be navigated.
Well, maybe that is true, but on the other hand, not everyone is a senior VP at Sony Pictures. It's a big difference. You have a little boutique versus you have a huge studio to run. You just mentioned the time of the pandemic as a chaotic time. Could you please elaborate that example a little bit? Because I believe you have something interesting about that as well.
Oh, look, and again, I can only speak in general terms. I don't really, want to speak on behalf of Sony, but it was a very, as everybody knows, it was an extraordinarily unpredictable time, and we were all experiencing a completely new set of circumstances, at the same time, right? In terms of being pushed into isolation, and for the studios being really unable to make shows and produce, at least in the early stages of the pandemic. And there was no playbook. Most pandemic playbooks at the time really focused on a pandemic that would take out a significant portion of your workforce, right? 30 to 50% was sort of the planning figure of people being sick or even worst case. So that was sort of the doctrine at the time around in crisis management around pandemics, was most of your workforce goes away. We didn't have that. We just had a workforce that wasn't allowed to go to work, right, because of isolation and things like that. So we had to sort of, flip the script and try to work. And all the studios did it collaboratively and highly effectively. And certainly at Sony, it was a very collaborative internal and highly collaborative and effective internal effort that resulted in the studio getting back to work very, very quickly. So again, just really, really very unpredictable situation. No playbook, just a need to communicate and collaborate quickly and clearly, right?
Right.
And to move at speed. And professionally, probably one of the most challenging times of my life.
Right. Well, that's indeed very interesting. Mr. Rich, we have witnessed strikes in Hollywood, and we've seen actors or people walking around the studios protesting. How did you and the studio navigate during these times? Was it any of inconvenience for the studio, for the team, or it was nothing really?
Oh, mate. Yeah, look, I think in terms of my job, it's really, it's business as usual in terms of, my team is still running security at gates. We're still, we're still supporting the facilities. We're still doing all of our systems monitoring and all of those sorts of, all of the routine day-to-day tasks that we would do. It was really an issue between the studios and the union. So it was all I can say is I think everybody was glad when it resolved.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Rich, the last question. I know you're busy and we've taken already a little bit more time than
No, that's perfect.
yeah. My last question would be, you are successful in your career. You were successful in the army. You have a wonderful family. If you could share with us 3 or 5 tips for success, and especially for the young people who are seeking for knowledge, seeking for making a good choice in their path in life.
Thank you. That's a great question, and they've all been great questions, Victor. Thank you. I've enjoyed this immensely. I think the first thing I would advise is seek feedback. Right, and that sounds self-evident, but I think a lot of people think that they're open to feedback, but actually taking that feedback and that constructive criticism and turning that into something actionable and that you can action and act upon and change in yourself, you need to be really intentional about that and deliberate. So it's not only seeking feedback, but it's being open to it, and then it's taking that feedback and actioning it, and not just thinking that that's somebody else's bias or maybe they didn't quite read it right or whatever. Hand in hand with that, and these two go together, I think it's in identifying your own blind spots. Everybody has blind spots. Nobody's perfect. And particularly at a younger age, if you can get a handle on what those blind spots might be, then you can start to address them, and I think that can help set you up for success. And I think in both of those, having a mentor of some kind is ideal, or a coach, or but I think as many reliable sources of information and advice, and emphasis on reliable, that you can have in your early career, I think is really important. I've talked about customer service mentality, and I just think it doesn't matter what you do, having that mentality baked into your DNA is just a really great success factor, right? It's something that it will never hold you back. It can only help. And so I'd encourage that. Written and verbal communication skills. Another one that sounds so obvious, and it is obvious, but it's so important. And your ability to shape your message. I don't think people spend enough time thinking about who they're communicating with, understanding the audience, and shaping the message to reach that audience, right? How you talk to a C-level executive versus how you talk to the guard at the front gate versus how you talk to your folks at your peers at the water cooler. How you convey a message, whether in writing or verbally, is so important. And knowing the difference of when to pick up the phone versus send an email or a text, by the way, but that's just another thought of mine. Then I think as you as your career starts to grow, probably the other most important thing is learning how to delegate effectively, right? You can't take on more and be successful unless you create capability around you and surround yourself with a team that can carry their end of that bargain. And delegation is almost an art form, right? And getting it right and doing it properly and making it effective so that everybody is successful, I think is a particular strength that's needed as your career progresses.
Thank you so much. I feel blessed that I'm right now. I got a chance to learn from you firsthand, and I'm extremely happy to share all this knowledge and all these advice to our viewers. Mr. Rich, thank you so much for coming to the show today, for sharing with us, for taking your time. I hope we can record many more episodes with you because you have so much to share, and I would be definitely looking towards making a documentary for you.
Well, you flatter me in all the right ways, Victor. Thank you so much. I appreciate and great questions. Really enjoyed the dialogue. So anytime you'd like to do it again, please let me know.
Thank you, sir. Will do.
Thank you, sir. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.